This episode of Advocates, the podcast, is supported by Taylor's Law School, where you master the skills, tactics, and ethics that these top advocates will be talking about.
Listen to the voices of the advocates.
Welcome to Advocates, the podcast, the place where you get to hear from the best legal talent in the world. Our guest for this episode certainly falls squarely into that category. He has been consistently rated star individual in Singapore, is lawyer to Singapore's prime ministers, and a devastating cross-examiner. We are very pleased to welcome you into the wide and interesting world of Davinder Singh SC. Okay, so let's start now with where you're from and tell us a little bit about your parents.
Okay, so my dad was from what is today Pakistan, then India before the partition. He came from a place called Quetta. Quetta is in a province called Balochistan. And for economic reasons and because of circumstances, he decided to move to this part of the world. First, Malaysia. He spent some time in Kuala Lumpur. And then he finally landed up in Singapore. My mom, she was born in and grew up in Kuala Lumpur. And so the family grew up in Singapore in the early days of independence in Singapore. He worked as a travel agent. My mom was a housewife, 2 brothers, 2 sisters. You know, the usual unfortunate story of the need in those days for the elders to sacrifice for the younger ones because of economic reasons. My eldest brother, who was by far the cleverest and on the way to medical school, had to give that up to pursue a career so that he could look after the family. And because of sacrifices like that, the rest of us got opportunities, including me.
Right. I can't help but observe that obviously, like most successful Singaporeans, your roots are in Malaysia. But let's now move a little bit from there to how, with your brother's help and your parents, how did your journey through school and then to law school begin?
Right. So my life story is one of good luck and blessings. So you have a kid who is short of talent and completely uninterested in school, just fumbling along day by day, year by year, getting along. And in those days, you would just be lucky to find a school, and your entire destiny sometimes is shaped by the school that you go to, the teachers that you have, the friends that you mix with. And so it was mostly how you got along yourself. Your parents were busy. They had other things they had to deal with, day-to-day, bread and butter issues. And so you very much were dependent on your elder siblings to make sure that you studied. And if there wasn't that attention from your siblings, then one could so easily just sort of slip into a situation where you just don't do well in school. So I went to a school called St. Michael's School, which was a Catholic missionary school, for no reason other than the fact that my elder brothers went there and it was close to home. And it was a great school because it wasn't just about studying, it was about an all-round education, and a very rare thing in those days. And thanks very much to the Jesuit mission that you had the brothers who stayed in Singapore with a view to teaching people from all races and religions. And so they respected the fact that you're a Sikh. They never sought to convert you. However, there were the usual morning and afternoon prayers, which you were at liberty to say or not say. And we all grew up different cultures, different backgrounds, different races, different religions, completely colorblind. And then from there, I went on to St. Joseph's Institution, which was a natural progression for students from St. Michael's. SJI was then known more for hockey, soccer, and rugby than its scholastic achievements. So that suited me very well. And so
Why is that?
because my interest in those days was such that those things excited me more than the classroom. But again, you just get by. You have teachers who do their best and students from all sorts of backgrounds. And unlike the situation today where you have in certain schools, students who are grouped together based on their talent, their achievements, their scores. In those days, you were put together because that was practical. And so you had different standards within the same classroom. And so you were very much on your own with teacher guidance. And it was up to you whether you would make it through the examinations or not. And so in SGI, I think the pivotal moment was after secondary 2, which is when you're 14, that's in Singapore. You choose whether you go to arts or science. And I mean, it's not so much a choice. It depends on the results that you get. And so, because my focus was not on my studies, I went into the art stream, much to my parents' disappointment. So I was like the last hope in the family, and I dashed their hopes. So I went to the art stream, and then, once you do that, of course, you don't realize it at that age, your career options suddenly narrow. Because you don't do science, you don't do engineering is out, medicine is out. And then in secondary 4, when I did the O levels, I was fortunate that questions that I spotted actually came out in the examinations. And so the results were decent enough for me to get into a very good college in Singapore called the National Junior College, NJC, which was then just newly set up. And so going from SGI, which was a school where everything was acceptable, to NJC, which was a government school where a lot was not acceptable, was a bit of a culture shock. But that took 2 years there in junior college, and after that in the army, another 2.5 years as an officer, and then ended up in law school.
And why law?
That's a very good question. And so I've been sort of asked that question many times, and I've had to search back as to why, what happened. So I think partly the fact that, as I said, when you go into the art stream, your options narrow. And also because of a remark, almost by the principal of the school. So one day when I was in SGI, I remember this very distinctly. The teacher didn't turn up for class, and so the principal stood in as a relief teacher. And Brother Patrick, that was his name, a strict guy. And so he set us a test, a spot test. And so we were working on that test, and he came by and he looked at my paper. And completely out of the blue, he just asked me, "Is your father a lawyer?" after reading my paper. And I said, "No." Then he put the paper down and he walked away. And I thought to myself, I was like 15 or 16 years old, thinking, oh my goodness, I must have impressed him so much with my text that he thinks that I can really make a point in a persuasive way. And I bet he didn't even mean that. He probably had nothing better to do that day, and he just walked by and he just asked that question because at that time there was a Sikh judge and here was a Sikh boy, and he probably wanted to know whether there was any connection between me and the Sikh judge. So the moral of the story is when teachers say something, they can have effects even if unintended. And so because of that, it stuck in my head that, maybe I do have a talent for saying a lot and meaning nothing. And so I should probably pursue a career in the law. So that got into my head and it stayed there. And when the results I got in junior college were sufficiently decent for me to try the law, and because it was a profession where I would not be dependent on anyone else, I decided to go for that.
Right. And was it very competitive at that time to get into NUS to do law?
It was pretty competitive. And in those days, unlike now where they look at your background, your CV, what you have done in outside studies, they don't just focus on your results. In those days, when you get your, what used to be called the A-level results in those days, I think it's your Form 6 in Malaysia, you could tell immediately that, okay, because of these results, I'm going to qualify for this particular course. So it happened for medicine, it happened for law. And yes, I mean, you needed to have a sufficiently decent grade in A levels to get into law. And the class was pretty small, about no more than 80 or 90. And there was no interview process. It was purely your results, and then they would select on that basis. So I was quite fortunate that I got in. And that was in and of itself an eye-opener, getting into law school in those 4 years. Yeah.
Right. I read somewhere that after you finished law school, of course, you applied to Drew Napier and joined the litigation department. So I want to wind that back a little bit to your time as a student and ask whether you had formed your choice of becoming an advocate or becoming a solicitor. And I say that because, some of our international listeners may not know, but Singapore has, like Malaysia, a fused profession. So when did you start forming that kind of choice?
Okay, so this is embarrassing. So, I said my life journey has been one of luck and blessings. It wasn't as though I sat down and charted my life and I said, this is what I'm going to do and this is what I'm going to focus on and this is my destination. If you met me in law school, well, you would have problems meeting me in law school because I hardly attended class. But if you knew me then, you would very easily conclude that this boy has no idea what he wants to do. Because university to me was a great opportunity to experience varsity life. And so the study of law was there. I mean, you had to do it, but it was incidental to that entire experience. And to answer your question, no. In the first 3 years, I think, I didn't give any thought to what I was going to do in practice. And in those days, you didn't have a system where you would go out and spend time as an intern in a law firm. The first time you would walk into a law office, unless you had connections with lawyers, was after graduation and when you applied for pupillage. And so I suppose I also wasn't thinking very much about what I would do because I was in law school because of a scholarship. I had applied for a scholarship from a bank called DBS. They gave me that scholarship, and so in return, I was bonded. So I had a job waiting for me. But one of the requirements of the bond was that I had to spend about 3 weeks a year with the bank. And so I did during the vacation. And as I spent more time there, in the third year or so, it suddenly dawned on me that this was probably not for me, being in-house counsel. And then some friends and I decided to take a shot at the Jessup Moods. We went to Washington. And there, the experience of the moods sort of settled in my mind that advocacy is what excites me. And because of that, after graduation, this is really interesting because after graduation, when I decided I wouldn't go to DBS, I started applying to different firms, large, medium, small firms. And I got rejections across the board. People will look at me and say, do you speak Chinese? No. Do you speak any other language? No. So what can you contribute? And all I had was my results and my moods. So for different reasons, at least ostensibly, they would say they couldn't take me on. One firm said that the bank that I am bonded to is a big client of theirs, and the client would be very unhappy if they took me. So that I was turned down. So I ended up completely without options, no job except the bank waiting for me. And as luck would have it, I spoke to one of my lecturers, a banking lecturer, and I told her about my predicament. She picked up the phone to Drew Napier and said, okay, this boy is looking for a job. He understands a bit of the law when I see him in law school. So you may want to give him a shot. And that was Harry Elias, who spent a lot of time in Kuala Lumpur. And so Harry gave me a job. And I'll never forget this. And this is something that I must share with you. So I walked in to Drew Napier at Clifford Center in Singapore in May 1983. And that one day changed my entire life. So I walk in and I'm a pupil with other pupils. And then I see this chap called Joe Grimberg walk by. And Joe Grimberg in those days was a giant. He was a giant. He was the supreme advocate, and everyone in Singapore who was anyone would go to him when they had an issue in court. And he was also Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's lawyer. And he became my pupil master for administrative reasons. Someone just put my name under him as pupil master, and I started working with him. And when you read about how people inspire you, so I'm living proof of that. From someone who had no interest in the law and who just sort of got by year after year, to then have this golden opportunity to meet this man who immediately, it was almost magical, immediately inspired me just by the way he talked, by the way he carried himself, by the way he thought through issues. It was transformational. So it became clear that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be the next Joe Grimberg. And that changed my life.
Can I come back and just break down a little bit about what Mr. Grimberg must have taught you and how he inspired you? Talk to us a little bit about how he practiced and how you today look at yourself and go, yeah, I do sort of practice in that same way. What are the main lessons?
So he didn't teach by talking to you. He would teach by example. And so the first thing about working with Joe Grimberg is that when you sit in for meetings or when he gives you a task, because of his seniority and because of the fact that he would only get the most complex and challenging of cases, the meetings and the tasks were always difficult. They were always difficult. And for some reason, I can't explain this, for some reason, I wanted very, very, very much that when he saw my work, he would be completely and utterly impressed. And so there is this quality that some people have that inspire others to do that, to go beyond their normal selves. And he had that quality. People looked up to him, they feared him, they respected him, they loved him. He was a gentleman. He was a real gentleman. And they knew that he was simply the best. And you just wanted to produce the best possible work so that when he reads it, he will say, wow, this is super. And this is good enough for me. And so that was the first thing that he inspired in people. And he certainly did in me. Second, when you sit in meetings with the clients, you just watch how he analyzes, how he breaks issues down, how he advises, and how the advice goes beyond the law to larger issues. And so there's this process of osmosis that's taking place and you don't even know it. It's sort of just seeping into you. Then when he prepares for cases, you see him staying back late nights in the office, working, getting up, reading the cases, reading the documents, doing everything himself at his age. He was by then, I think, in his late 40s. He could easily have delegated that to others, but he was doing it all by himself. And then you see him preparing for appeals. And he would write out every question he was going to ask in cross-examination. He would write out everything that he would say to the court in opening. He would write out everything he was going to say to the appellate courts. And that required a lot of effort. And he had a way with the words. You know, he was very smooth, very eloquent, and his turn of phrase was extremely impressive. So when you see that, you say that, I want to be Joe Grimberg, I have to do that. I mean, you'll never get close to the mastery of English that he had, but at least you try. And so everything about him just inspired by example. And then when you go to court with him, you would see that even if he had a difficult case, the judges would listen to him very carefully. They would give him the utmost respect. They would eat out of his hands. And the client would know that even if he lost, he couldn't have got a better lawyer. And so that was Joe. And so, in short, because of everything he did and because of the way he did it, that set an example for anyone who wanted to achieve that, to just follow suit. I mean, that's what the law is about, isn't it? It's mentorship, pupillage. It's about imitation. And so, and I've said this before to many juniors, that their life sometimes depends on who their first pupil master is. That can decide whether you're going to be a serious lawyer or you're going to take a different approach to the way things are done. And so I was really blessed to have that opportunity to be his pupil. And then after that, he decided that Drew Napier will pay off the bond and retain me. And then I became his legal assistant and did all his work. And I decided that I would make myself indispensable to him. And so one thing led to another, to another, to another.
Yeah, so if I can sort of package that, Can I just step back a little bit now and just ask, clearly inspirational figure, but if there's one lesson now that you took from him and you practice today that you would give to a young advocate, what would that be? That one lesson?
I would say that he never compromised on the need to go the extra mile. So it's just work. It's just effort. I'm now in my 60s, and once you develop a habit, it gets programmed into you. And it comes back to haunt you like it's now haunting me, because when I get out my cases, it's not easy to say, I'll take a shortcut, because that's not how you're programmed. And so he was like that. And the lesson was quite clear, which is anybody can do this. You just have to make an effort, or you have to go a mile beyond that your opponent is prepared to go. And it'll pay off at the end of the day. Win or lose, it'll pay off, because the judges will know whether you've prepared your case. Your client will know how well prepared you are, and whether you've done right by them. So I would say that is one of the most important lessons. The other thing, though, which he was very, very, very famous for, which I don't think I've picked up on, is the fact that he was a gentleman in all his dealings. So he would be courteous to a fault with his opponents, and they respected him for that. So Joe never treated people differently depending on who they were. So whether you were on his side or you were on the other side, he was always courteous. And his letters were polite and written in the best traditions of the bar. But today, and this is an excuse, it's not a reason, it's an excuse. The landscape has gotten so competitive that sometimes you slip into combative tones and you take aggressive positions. And so I wish I could be like Joe, but I am not. I'm not. And you know what? When Joe passed away and people were talking about his life during his memorial, everyone knew he was the best. But the legacy that people remembered him most for was the fact that he was a gentleman at the bar. And that says something.
Yes, it does. Absolutely. So now let's come back to the young Davinder Singh, who's had a couple of years under Joe Grimberg. You're working your way through Drew Napier. I take it that the main type of work that you did was commercial work in those days?
Yes. So because Joe did commercial work, commercial disputes, that's what I did, yes.
Right. And how quickly did you get onto your hind legs, as it were, and start arguing cases and doing trials?
So I was lucky there again, because when I came into Drew, the partners were already well established, and they were in their late 40s, early 50s. And they had cases coming in which were complex, which were less complex, which were straightforward. And Drew Napier was then regarded as the premier litigation firm in Singapore. And so because there was so much work and the seniors were unable to do it all themselves, they let us do it. They let us take open the files, go into court, make our own mistakes, and learn. Something that you hardly see these days because of various reasons. But then my colleagues and I, who were pupils, one of my colleagues is now a Court of Appeal judge, Stephen Chong. He was my classmate in law school, and he was a fellow pupil with me in Drew, and then we also grew up in that firm. We were just thrown into the deep end. So go to court, run with the files, deal with the clients, and over and above that, Joe would pass his clients to me. So because he's so busy, and even where the cases were large and complex, he would tell the clients, I'm going to ask you to go and see Davinder. I'm going to ask you to see Stephen. They will look after you. And because he said that, it came with an endorsement. And the clients would accept that. And that put, of course, a greater responsibility on your shoulders to do even better, right? And so we had those opportunities which young lawyers today don't have, which is to immediately get into court.
Right, and argue your own cases. One thing that struck me looking at your CV, just in terms of the cases that you've done, is just a wide range of legal topics that you've covered, from administrative law to regulatory law to libel to commercial law. Now, is that a function that in those days one didn't specialize as opposed to now, or was that a conscious decision on your part?
I don't think it was conscious because, unlike Stephen, for example, who joined the shipping department, which was a very specialized department in those days, and there was a lot of work in Singapore, a lot of shipping work in Singapore in those days. When you're a commercial litigator, you do everything. So Joe did that. Joe did contract disputes, tort, libel, administrative law, and because he did that, I was exposed to those same areas. And so what happened was Joe was not only a lawyer for many clients, but he was also a lawyer's lawyer. So many people who came to him were themselves lawyers. They were briefing him as counsel. And so because I sat in for those meetings, I assisted Joe in those cases, the lawyers also had an opportunity to assess me as I was working with Joe as a junior. And because of the wide range of cases that they would bring to him, where they were cases that were not so complex, but also in that same wide range, they would sometimes run it by me. And so from there, I developed my practice of also doing the similar type of cases.
Right, right. Now, we come to 97, the year I think the Singapore Supreme Court introduced senior counsel in Singapore. And you obviously, I think, the first batch of SCs who were appointed. I'm interested to ask you, because in Malaysia, for example, we don't have that badge, and there are other jurisdictions that don't as well. What do you think of the thought process in terms of bringing that rank in, and what do you think it's done for the profession?
Those are good questions. So in those days, there was a debate in Singapore about, is the profession growing, or are we still, as advocates, relying on the crutch that QCs offered? So when I joined in 83, when I joined the profession in 83, it was a common occurrence in court to see QCs. So QCs would come in to argue cases which were arguably not even difficult. And because of this very comfortable relationship that Singapore lawyers had with the QCs, and because QCs would come and do these cases, there was a concern that the bar was not growing because everything was, let's just go to the QC. And I think there was also a sense that more and more Singapore talent was going into corporate law, finance, M&A. And there wasn't a desire on the part of many good lawyers to go into court because of various reasons. And so I think the government and the judiciary got together and they thought about how to rectify this situation. They recognized that they still needed specialists coming out of London for the very difficult cases. At the same time, they needed to give a reason to young lawyers to get into advocacy, some reason to aspire to something. And then the SC thing came out in that context. It was decided that if you had a core group of SCs who the judges believe that the entire profession would universally accept as being practitioners who they should look up to in advocacy, and they have this, as you say, that badge, hopefully they would aspire to that. And it worked. It worked. I think more and more of the better graduates then decided to do advocacy. And then a good number of them have since become senior counsel. And it's still something that many young lawyers aspire to. I know that because people come to me as referees when they make applications to be SC, and I happily do that. Whether they succeed or not, the fact is that many want to be an SC because they have invested so much time in advocacy, and they hope that with that there is recognition of what they have been doing.
Right. And can I ask, in terms of the way you work, and I ask this in the context of some of the silks in the UK that we've spoken to, their method of working has changed from the time they were a junior to the time they were a silk. And I'm wondering whether you have that same experience.
I've not sat down with any senior to sort of work with them and see how they work. I mean, I've watched Joe Grimberg work. I've seen his notes. And because, as I was saying earlier, in the 80s, QCs used to come in quite a bit. There's one in particular, a gentleman by the name of Michael Belloff. Michael Belloff was a leading administrative law QC in England. And a few years down the road, after that, he left and became president of Trinity at Oxford. And then after that, he came back to the bar. So Joe knew Michael and brought him out for an administrative dispute, domestic tribunal in Singapore. And he appeared for the organization. And Joe then said, okay, look after Michael and support him in this case. And so I remember driving to the airport in my beat up Volvo, and I picked him up at the airport. Joe said that, don't worry, he'll recognize you. I told him to look out for a turban. And so I said, okay, good. And so Michael comes out, and then I'm driving him to the Raffles Hotel where he's staying. And Michael was then known, Joe told me, as a master in cross-examination. So I thought I will, in that drive, try to get some tips from him. And so I started talking to him about how he did his work. And he was speaking very, very generally. And that was fine. Then we went for the hearing. And then I saw his cross-examination. It was simply breathtaking, And today, I still apply the same lessons that Michael taught me from that cross-examination. So again, luck. I sat next to him and he just had a few notes on his note paper. No list of questions, just a few notes. And with that, he started formulating questions, locking him into a position, and it was just masterful. So you have that. And then because you recognize your own limitations and you say, no, that is not something I can do. I can't just put 3 points on a piece of paper and then go in and cross-examine for 2 hours. So I take the safe way out, which is in the beginning, I started writing all my questions down as Joe used to do. And then as time went and you develop a bit of confidence, you don't do that in such detail, but you still do it. You still write out the main points you want to make, because I find that when you write and rewrite and then rewrite again, it actually gets into your head. It gets into your head. And it's so much easier when you're on your feet to remember your direction and remember your objectives, because you already know from writing and rewriting what the points are and where you're headed. So the style has changed. My personal style has changed, but I don't think there is any substitute for reading the papers and writing down the main points you want to run with, writing down the documents and the parts you need to pick up and cross-examine on. And even if you don't use them, they may just come up in the course of the hearing and you will know them. So it's still valuable.
Okay, it's interesting because that dovetails into the next area I wanted to ask you about, because I mean, one of the things you're best known for is your forensic skills. I can just name the NKF case and, the blogger case and your cross-examination in those two. So we've taken these lessons from Mike and Belloff, and you've obviously molded them into your own. So if you were to tell us now, where do you start when it comes to preparing for cross-examination? And then how you form your questions. I'm interested in those two sort of aspects.
Okay, so I'll just work backwards here, because some years ago I gave a talk to the justice law clerks in the court. They asked me a similar question about cross-examination, and I told them something which is true, that after all my preparation, there are many times where seconds before I stand up, I still do not know what my first question is going to be. And that is despite the fact that I've written down my questions. And I tend to be I'll come back to that in a moment, more detailed in the first few areas so that I get the momentum going. But despite that, I don't know many times what my first question is going to be, because you can prepare everything you want. You just don't know on the day what comes out from the witness's mouth. In those days, of course, you had oral evidence in chief. And now, of course, you have written evidence in chief. You just don't know what the judge is interested in. And he might say something which might make you change the way you're going to start your cross-examination. So that, I find, is an incredibly interesting challenge. Because if you kick off in an area which is wrong or doesn't cut any ice with the court, then you start off on the wrong footing, obviously, and that doesn't help you. But coming back to the preparation itself, so, I mean, you have the usual, which is you start with the pleadings, and then now where you have written evidence in chief, you read that, and then you read the documents. So having done that, what I do is I ask myself, what are the main points I would like to make to the judge after the cross-examination in submissions? And I tell myself that that's the second opportunity to do that. The first opportunity to have a conversation with the judge is cross-examination. So, in my view of things, cross-examination is not about you and the witness. Cross-examination is a dialogue between you and the judge, where by your questions, you are actually trying to persuade the court to your point of view, right? The judge listens, and your submissions actually start in the course of your cross-examination. And sometimes the questions can be more potent than the answers. As you well know, that sometimes there are some answers are so obvious that where the witness refuses to give those answers or denies those answers or disputes those answers, his credibility is affected. And when you do that, obviously, you're making a point with the judge. And that's part of the ongoing conversation, silent conversation that you're having with the judge. And so when I prepare my notes, I ask myself first, what are the points I want to communicate to the court in cross-examination, using the witness as my medium? And second, where the witness refuses to be my medium, what questions should I ask, which, because of the nature of the questions, is sufficient to pass the message about the point I want to make? So having got those broad points, I then ask myself whether those broad points cover all the issues in the case. And if they do cover all the issues in the case, I then go point by point to develop the questions that I need to reach that conclusion that I started off with.
Can I just say that's fascinating? We've interviewed a number of people and no one has quite described it that way, having that silent communication with the judge. And that is absolutely fascinating. So I guess what that means is you've got to sort of just be able to grasp that moment, as opposed to flog a witness to death. You've just got to be able to grasp it and make sure that's being communicated swiftly, cleanly, and clearly to the judge. And that's why how you form your question is that important. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you find, as you know, that things usually take a different turn in cross-examination. I mean, very rare is the case where everything goes to plan. The witness says something, or the judge says something which suggests that he's not with you or he's not following. And then the alarm bell rings and you say, oops, I'm not making my point. He's not following it, or he doesn't understand it, or he's not with me. And so the nature of the conversation then changes. And then you have to then say, okay, what's plan B? I don't pretend to prepare a plan B, because you just focus on plan A, you've got your objective and you just want to hit there. So a lot also depends on what happens on the day and how you react and how flexible you are, how versatile you are, taking into account anything that the judge might say. I mean, the worst kind of judge for me in cross-examination is someone who just keeps quiet, because you don't know whether you are making headway. And so if the judge has comments or says things in the course of the cross-examination, that helps. It's a road sign. And so you take note of that. And it can be both adverse or positive.
Yeah, fascinating. Let me now jump into the other side of legal work. Apart from the forensics, we've got the scholarship. And clearly, apart from you're very well known for your trial work, you've argued many, many appeals in the Court of Appeal in Singapore. Do you enjoy the forensic work more, or do you enjoy the scholarship more?
Okay, very good question. My preference is trial work. I enjoy the cross-examination. I enjoy the cut and thrust. I enjoy the fact that the canvas is still blank and you have a greater influence on what appears on the canvas at the end of the day. Whereas when you go on appeal, you are dealing with a set position. Things have been done, questions have been asked, conclusions have been reached, views have been formed. And when you are acting for an appellant, it can be challenging because you want to persuade three judges that one of their fellow judges got it terribly wrong, despite his experience, despite the fact that he's carefully gone through the entire record and gave a lot of time to the matter. And that's a different challenge. So it is partly legal and it is partly non-legal. The legal part, of course, is to point out where where he got the law wrong, or where he missed the evidence, or he made an error in this respect or that aspect. The part which is more challenging is to persuade the court that it should interfere. So that part sometimes is not just the law, but about the Court of Appeal's policy. Should it be interfering just because it disagrees, or if it had said, if one of them had said as the trial judge, would it have come to a different conclusion? So that usually don't know what the judges are thinking, how they view things. And so you have less control and influence over that. And I find that to be not as exciting as forensic work, not something that I can influence as much as I can do in a trial.
Yes, I think that must be correct. In your preparation for appellate work, you've told us about how you prepare for your cross-examination. Your opening 10 minutes, we all know how important that is in any appeal. How much time do you spend thinking about that? How much time do you spend thinking about the language you use for that?
Okay, so humility is really important here. Because in the Singapore Court of Appeal, you have limited time. And because you have a Court of Appeal which is always on top of the matter, the three judges invariably read the papers inside out, and they know the case so well that they cannot but form a preliminary view about the matter. And so whatever plans you have laid for yourself in terms of your opening, etc., they go awry after maybe 3 minutes. After you identify the issues and you start on the first issue, the Court of Appeal is on you. And they want clarity in their minds of the questions that they have. So they want to use your limited time to understand certain aspects which they are troubled by. And that may be different. That may be different from what you want to say. So again, very rarely, as an appellant, have I gone to page 2 of my notes, because they are already on me, as they will be on any other lawyer, saying, yeah, but and you said this in your appellant's case, but the judge said that. What do you say about this? And then you are completely off your script. And once that happens, another judge jumps in, as you know, then the third jumps in, and then everything becomes completely unplanned, right? But that doesn't mean you don't prepare, because you obviously need a structure. You need, in the event you do have time, to make the points you want to make. Now, I said humility is all important because when you're preparing for an appeal, you are actually preparing for what is mostly unknown. You know what you want to say. You know what the judge has already said, but you don't know what's troubling the Court of Appeal. And it sometimes can be something that you can never anticipate. And so what I try to do is I get my juniors on the file to tell me what troubles them about this case. That I find to be very helpful. So if they tell me that, we've made this point and the other side has made that point, I think the judges are going to have this difficulty. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, if this is a difficulty, do I deal with it, or do I go with my strong points and then come to that later? Or do I go with my strong points and let the judges pounce on me on that, and then I'll deal with it? So then that becomes a matter of judgment. But there is no substitute, and this also applies to a trial. There is no substitute for sitting with your juniors and talking through the case, because you can't, very few people can understand it from all perspectives. And the one thing about being a trial lawyer is, as you well know, is the more you get involved in a case, the more partisan you become. If you really feel for the client and you want to do your best, not just for the client, but for yourself, within the bounds of ethics, you have to identify yourself with the cause while keeping some distance and being objective. But when you do that, and as you prepare your cross-examination and as you prepare your submissions for the appeal, you start believing in the strength of your points. And that can be a trap, because then you become blindsided by points that you are not seeing because of that. And that's why you need honest juniors who sit in front of you petrified and try to tell you diplomatically that, hello, maybe you should be thinking about this, or but what about that? So if practitioners just did that, used their juniors to guide them, you will do so much better.
Can I ask you, just following from that, to just end off this area, the fact of you working with teams and with juniors, of course, in Malaysia, in Singapore, in other parts of Asia, we all do that. But clearly, Asian culture is one where sort of telling the boss he's wrong is not easy. Now, clearly, the way you work, that is an important aspect of that any junior has to bring to the table. How do you encourage that?
Okay, so that's really difficult. I'll tell you why. It's also because not just the fact that they want to be very respectful, sometimes without realizing it, actually every time, without realizing it, when they make a point to me, I argue back with ferocity. And then while I think I'm defending my position, I'm actually frightening them. And they are saying, oh, okay, better, I think I better keep my mouth shut. And so that process then doesn't achieve the objective. They, of course, worry that, does he think that we're making a stupid point? Is he so passionate about his response that he thinks we should never even have made this point in the first instance? Why did we even think of this point? And so it depends on the kind of personalities you have across the table. Even my partners, they would find their own diplomatic way of saying, maybe not. I don't think you want to run with this point because, and the other part of humility is judgment. So a lawyer may be very good in one particular aspect. He may be eloquent, for example, or he may be excellent in the law. But as you know, a lot of it is about sensing the judge's views, sensing his or her likes, saying things which fit with the judge's philosophy of how things should be done and said, and what might be said which the judge may not like. Leaving aside the law, he may not like an aggressive position, for example. He may sympathize with one party for reasons that you don't share. So all of that input you need from people around you. And that's why I always have a team on a file. And when I'm preparing, I'm sending emails to them, I'm having calls with them, I'm calling them into my room, asking them not just about the facts or the law. Also, if I say this, how do you think this particular judge is going to react? What is his background in terms of issues of this nature? And so the seniors can help you there more than the juniors because they don't have the same kind of experience with the judges. But the juniors are useful to have because not only do they know the facts better than you do, but you want just a fresh perspective. It could be a perspective you disagree with, but it's very important. So I don't pretend to be the best person to generate candid and fresh views because of the way I react sometimes. But it is all important. It is all important.
Yeah, critical. Okay, so let's now verge away from a career in law. 1988, you stood for Parliament. I have two questions arising from that. Number one, why? And number two, how did you balance that with obviously what was a very busy practice?
Okay. So in 1987, Professor Jayakumar, who taught me constitutional law in law school, asked me to consider being a member of parliament. And I think the PAP then was looking for young people, different backgrounds, different training to contribute. And I wasn't very sure I would do it for a number of reasons. One was I was very much into my career. I just was focused on advancing my career, and a lot of time had to be spent. So I I think primarily because of Joe and his inspiration and the fact that I wanted to do well for him, I would be in the office till the early hours of every morning just to deliver. And so it was quite clear to me that being an MP would be a problem time-wise, not just about having to go to Parliament, but spending time in the constituency. But then I asked myself, what would I say 30 years from now? Should I not have taken up the opportunity to see another side of life, just not be one-dimensional and just be a lawyer? And I thought, these opportunities don't come to everyone, and I should seriously consider it and try it. But there were two other factors that I think swung it. The first was, so I just wanted to make my mom proud. I knew that my dad adored Lee Kuan Yew, but he had passed on by then. And I knew my mom adored Lee Kuan Yew for what he did. And so I knew that my mom would be very proud that Lee Kuan Yew wanted me to be part of his team.
Actually, that again brings me to the next point I wanted to speak to, which was this, that I read somewhere that obviously of how much respect your parents had for Mr. Lee. Particularly, I think there was one incident I read about when he came to your military base and you were a cadet, and how proud your father was that he'd come. What struck me about what you said about your parents and Mr. Lee was this immigrant's tale of, obviously, your father from India, your mother from Malaysia, and this sort of amazing respect they had for this man. And I'm interested why it is that you have, immigrants who come to this new country and you have this prime minister. What was it about him that sort of brought them together for Singapore in that sense?
Okay, so you've done your homework. You've read so much. I grew up in a household where Lee Kuan Yew was a god. And the reason he was a god to my mother and father is that they had come to Singapore because of circumstances outside their control. And they had come as minorities into a country which was populated primarily by the Chinese. And so my father in particular had seen life in India, had seen how politicians behaved in India, had seen hardship in India. And my mom grew up in Malaysia. She got married young, but still she appreciated what was happening in Malaysia in terms of the politics and in terms of how people were regarded and opportunities were given. So then they come to Singapore. And they now had to find a way to keep the food coming in and to educate the children. And there's this man who decides to clean up the place. In the early days, there were gangsters and people who come knocking on your door. There was protection money. He cleaned that up. He promised to educate your children. And it didn't matter to him whether you're black, white, yellow, or brown. And there were jobs. And for them, that was enough. For someone like that to do this for them, that was enough. And their children now had a chance. And that's why in the army camp, the story you read, he stood up, even though Lee Kuan Yew would never have known that he stood up. So growing up in that household and being so taken in by what I'm told Lee Kuan Yew had done, I go into a law firm where the senior partner is Lee Kuan Yew's own lawyer. And by that time, I have seen Lee Kuan Yew on the television. I've seen him make speeches, and I think he is amazing. And then this man, who was a god to my father and whom my mother worshipped, asks me to join the party and be one of his MPs through Jayakumar. And that means a lot. And it's very difficult to explain it, but it means a lot. So I really wanted, apart from the reasons I gave you earlier, I wanted to meet the man. I wanted to get to know him. I wanted to just have the experience of dealing with him. But I mean, how many people on this earth would have the opportunity not just of being with him in the same party and being an MP, but also then in due course acting for him? How many people on this earth would have the opportunity to sit across this giant and learn and learn and learn? And that was what he was. He was a giant. And so, as I said, luck and blessings.
Well, let me ask you that question, the next question following from that, which is, what was he like as a client?
Okay, I want to share something with you. I don't know whether I've said this before and in writing, but one day Joe Grimberg gave me a lift to a hearing. And, we were just having polite conversation. And he asked me, he said, Davinder, what would you like to be in 10 to 15 years? And I don't know what made me say it, but I said it anyway. I said, Mr. Grimberg, I'd like to be Lee Kuan Yew's lawyer. And he said, you will be. I'll never forget that. He said, you will be. I'm sorry for being so emotional. It's about Joe and my mom and dad. And then when I joined the party, let me tell you about luck. So I, of course, interacted with him on political matters, but not much interaction. And in those days, you remember that Lee Kuan Yew used to sue for defamation, right? And Joe was his lawyer. Then after Joe was another lawyer called Tan Kok Kwan. And there were elections in early 1996. And someone defamed him in the elections. And one morning, the phone rang in my house. In those days, there were no mobile phones, so it was the landline. And I picked up the phone, and it was Lee Kuan Yew's security officer saying, Mr. Lee wants to talk to you. And when you get that kind of message, you just prepare for the worst. And he said, Davinder, did you read in the papers today what so and so said about me? I said, yes, I did. Tan Kok Kwan, I can't reach him. I'm told he's in Canada. I want you to act. So talk about luck.
Wow. And what was he like as a client?
Amazing. I tell you, he was. So you have this client whose intelligence is very difficult to describe. Okay, Gopal, I've never come across a man like him who has this ability to look into the future, who can understand anything you tell him, and who can see things that others don't. The last time he practiced law was in the probably 50s or 60s. I don't know. Must be 50s, because I think he then went into politics in the late 50s. He was from Cambridge. In 1996, I'm talking to him about libel law, and he's correcting me. And he is saying, do you know that when I was in Cambridge, my lecturer so-and-so told me, and I'm sitting there, the guru is talking, and I am just listening, And you have that kind of a powerhouse. So every time I talked to him about cases, it was an exhilarating experience. He would be teaching me. He would listen. But in the course of that discussion, whether on the phone or face to face, he is teaching you not only about the law, he just always has the urge to teach you about the bigger picture, about how this case and what he's doing is relevant to the larger issues in the country and why. And then he moves from that topic to another topic and then to another topic. And you're just learning and absorbing. People would pay millions of dollars to have 10 minutes with him. And I was sitting there sometimes for hours just having these lessons for free.
Let's turn now to the last section we have, which is what we call the quickfire section, where we ask you a question, you give us a one-word answer, and if you want to spend another 30 seconds explaining it, go ahead. So let's start off with, what does Davinder Singh SC do when he's not working?
Oh gosh, very little.
Describe very little for us.
Okay, so because I chose to focus my life on the law, I did not develop hobbies. And my social circle sort of became smaller and smaller with each passing year. And so at the end of the day, at about maybe 10 or 11 p.m., I take refuge in Netflix. And if there are some nice Bollywood movies that don't require the use of a brain, I welcome the opportunity.
Right. Okay. Brilliant. Second question. I want you to describe just one skill which you think is the most important for an advocate.
Hard work.
Hard work. Okay. Third question. What area of practice did you enjoy the most? And I divide this into two, which is firstly, the intellectual exercise or the interpersonal exercise.
I would say it's intellectual. It's the intellectual exercise. And because as an advocate, you just want to win, of course, within boundaries. And so that brings a lot of satisfaction. Well, there are different levels of satisfaction. Sorry for elaborating. There's the satisfaction of doing your best. There's the satisfaction of winning. But then there's a huge pain to losing because you've tried your best. And so that's the price you pay.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. And you don't have to name the person, you can describe them. The opponent you respect most.
So someone who, I never, of course, crossed swords with Joe Grimberg, but I crossed swords with QCs. And the QCs who used to come to Singapore, who conducted themselves like Joe in the best traditions of the English bar, that I respected and enjoyed a great deal.
Okay. The next question I have is, who did you learn the most from? But I think there are obviously two characters I can pick out. I'll answer that for you, Joe Grimberg and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. All right, next one. And it doesn't have to be a sitting judge. It can be a judge who's retired. The judge who challenged you the most as an advocate.
They all do, but my baptism of fire was when I did one of my first few cases before a judge who was well known for his temper. And because I was acting for the big boys against a small chap, and the judge was known to be very pro small man, I had hell. But that wounded me a great deal, and I smarted from it for a number of years after that. It taught me lifelong lessons.
Brilliant. And the last question I have is, describe a day in the life of Davinder Singh SC.
Okay, so the right word would be sad. Really, because in the morning I get up, it's emails. If it's not emails, it's calls. If it's not calls, it's getting up. And so that's the description of a day in my life.
Okay, brilliant. So that's all I have. Can I just speak for myself? I think that of all the interviews we've done, this has been one of the most fascinating. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for doing so much homework on this. I'm really impressed that you've read so much. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you for listening to that episode of Advocates, the podcast. Do follow us on our website and on all our social media platforms. We hope you tune in to our next episode.
Listen to the voices of the advocate.